You never expect the first wound to come from the people who taught you how to speak, how to eat, how to survive the world, because before you learned danger had a face, you learned it had a last name. And that realization arrives quietly, almost politely, as a feeling you can't explain but can't escape. A tension in your chest when their name appears on your phone, a silence that feels heavier than anger, a sense that something sacred was crossed without ceremony. Because family betrayal doesn't explode, it seeps. It moves through you slowly, rewriting your instincts, teaching your body to flinch where it once leaned in, and you don't even realize when it happens. Only that one day you look back and understand this was the moment your innocence died. You've carried this longer than you admit, and that's because betrayal by blood doesn't announce itself as cruelty. It disguises itself as concern, as jokes that cut just a little too deep, as advice that subtly steers you away from power, as loyalty that evaporates the moment you stop being useful. And the reason it hurts so deeply is not because they harmed you, but because they had access. They knew your fears before you learned how to hide them. They watched you grow before you learned how to defend yourself. And when they turned, they didn't need weapons. They already knew where to aim. This is the forbidden truth no one prepares you for. That family is not always a sanctuary. Sometimes it is the first battlefield. And the wounds you receive there don't bleed outward. They bleed inward, shaping how you trust, how you love, how you measure your worth. Because when strangers betray you, you can call it life. But when family does, your mind searches for a flaw in yourself, something you must have done wrong, something you must have deserved. And that question becomes a quiet poison you sip for years. You're not broken. You were never taught another way, because the first lessons you learned about loyalty, power, and love came from people who may have loved you in their own limited way, but also competed with you, resented you, feared your potential. And here is where the darkness begins. Because family betrayal is rarely about hatred, it's about hierarchy, about unspoken roles, about what happens when you grow beyond the version of you that kept the system comfortable. They loved you when you were small, when you were dependent, when your success reflected back on them without threatening their position. But the moment you began to change, to outgrow, to see through patterns they relied on to stay in control, something shifted and suddenly encouragement became silence. Pride became comparison, and support became subtle sabotage. And you felt it before you understood it. A tightening in the room, a change in tone, a sense that your light was no longer welcome. This is where most people gaslight themselves, telling themselves family would never do that. Blood is thicker than water. They mean well. But that belief is how the damage continues, because Machiavellian dynamics do not disappear in families. They intensify. They hide behind obligation, tradition, and guilt. And the most ruthless power games are the ones played by people who know you'll hesitate to call them out because they share your blood. You survived things you still don't have words for. Moments when you realize the people who should have protected you were watching you struggle without lifting a hand. Or worse, benefiting from your confusion, your self-doubt, your need for approval. And the cruelty of it is not just the act, it's the aftermath. The way you question your instincts, the way you replay conversations years later, wondering if you imagined it, wondering if you're allowed to feel angry, wondering if walking away makes you ungrateful, disloyal, cold. This is the moment your life begins to make sense, not because the pain disappears, but because you finally see the pattern clearly. And clarity, even when it hurts, is the beginning of power. Family betrayal operates in whispers, not screams, because screaming would reveal intent, and intent is dangerous when the relationship itself is the leverage. So instead, it arrives as mixed signals, affection paired with control, help paired with humiliation, love paired with debt. And the most confusing part is that some of it is real, which is why it works. Because no one manipulates you better than someone who occasionally shows up exactly how you needed them to. You start to notice that support comes with conditions, that praise arrives only when it keeps you in a role that benefits them, that concern surfaces whenever you step outside the boundaries they've drawn for you, and the moment you assert yourself, the temperature drops, the warmth disappears, replaced by silence, disappointment, or moral superiority. And suddenly you're the problem, the difficult one, the selfish one, the ungrateful one. And that label sticks because it comes from the people whose approval once meant survival. This is where Machiavellian psychology becomes unavoidable, because what you're witnessing is not random cruelty, it's a power correction, a system defending itself. And families, like empires, resist internal threats more fiercely than external ones, because an outsider can be dismissed, but an insider who sees clearly is dangerous. And so the response is subtle punishment, withdrawal of affection, triangulation, turning others against you quietly, rewriting history until you doubt your own memory. They may never confront you directly because direct confrontation invites resistance. Instead, they plant narratives. They speak out of concern. They question your choices in front of others. They frame your growth as arrogance, your boundaries as betrayal, your independence as abandonment. And the brilliance of this strategy is that it forces you into a defensive posture, constantly explaining yourself, constantly justifying your existence, constantly trying to prove you're still worthy of love. You're allowed to want more, but they taught you to associate that desire with guilt. Because your wanting exposes their stagnation, your growth highlights their compromises, and instead of rising with you, they pull you back, not because they hate you, but because power fears displacement, even in families, especially in families. The deepest betrayal is not the obvious one. It's the slow erosion of self-trust, the way you begin to censor yourself around them, the way your body tenses before gatherings, the way you prepare explanations in advance, rehearsing defenses for accusations that haven't been spoken yet, but always seem to arrive. And over time, this vigilance becomes your normal. Your nervous system learns that love is unpredictable, conditional, and tied to performance. This is why family betrayal destroys you silently, because there is no clean villain, no single moment you can point to, only a pattern. And patterns are harder to grieve than events, because you keep hoping they'll change, keep remembering moments when they were kind, keep telling yourself you're overreacting, and that hope is what keeps you trapped, because hope without boundaries is just another form of self-abandonment. You're not imagining this, and the reason that sentence hits so hard is because someone trained you to doubt your perception, to privilege their version of reality over your own, to believe that harmony matters more than truth. And that is the most Machiavellian move of all. Because once you surrender your perception, they don't need to control you directly. You do it for them. Families enforce hierarchy through emotion, not force through guilt, obligation, and fear of exile. And the threat is rarely spoken, but always understood, that love can be withdrawn, that belonging is conditional, that safety is temporary. And when you grow up inside that system, your nervous system adapts, becoming hyper-aware, hyper-responsible, always scanning for shifts in mood, always trying to keep the peace, because peace became your currency. This is where the predator-prey dynamic reverses without you realizing it, because the child who once depended on them becomes the adult who carries the emotional labor, who absorbs the tension, who mediates conflicts that were never yours to fix. And they learn, consciously or not, that your empathy is a resource, your loyalty a tool, your silence an asset. And yet something in you knows this cannot continue. Something in you feels the cost, the exhaustion, the quiet resentment that scares you because it feels forbidden. Because you were taught that anger towards family is wrong, but anger is information, and the anger you feel is not cruelty, it's clarity knocking. The first psychological shift happens when you stop asking why they did it and start asking what it cost you to keep pretending they didn't. Because the question was never about their intent, it was about the damage, and the damage is real. Measured in lost confidence, delayed decisions, muted ambition, relationships you sabotaged because chaos felt familiar, opportunities you declined because standing out felt dangerous. You begin to see how deeply this pattern shaped you, how you learned to make yourself smaller to stay safe, how you learned to over-explain to avoid punishment, how you learned to anticipate needs that were never spoken, and how that skill, once necessary, now keeps you trapped because the world rewards clarity and boundaries, not self-erasure. This realization hurts because it means grieving not just the family you had, but the family you thought you had, the one that existed in moments, in flashes, in memories that now feel unreliable. And grief like that is complicated because it doesn't fit the stories people tell about family. It doesn't come with casseroles or condolences. It comes with judgment, with people telling you to forgive, to understand, to remember they did their best as if your pain is an inconvenience. Here is the ruthless truth Machiavelli would never soften. That loyalty without power is submission. And many families mistake submission for love. They confuse obedience with respect, and when you stop submitting, they call it betrayal. Because from their perspective, you broke an unspoken contract, the contract where you agreed to carry the weight so they wouldn't have to. This is the moment where your internal compass recalibrates, where you realize that the guilt you feel when asserting yourself is not proof you're wrong, it's proof you're changing, and change threatens systems built on predictability, especially systems that benefited from your silence. You start to notice how they react to your boundaries, not with curiosity, not with reflection, but with offense, as if your no is an attack, as if your autonomy is cruelty. And this reaction tells you everything you need to know, because people who respect you do not punish you for protecting yourself. They adjust, they adapt, they meet you where you are. The shift is subtle but irreversible, because once you see the pattern, you can't unsee it, and you begin to understand that the love you were chasing was conditional by design, and that chasing it kept you trapped in a role that no longer fits. And the fear now is not of losing them, but of losing yourself if you stay. This is where most people stall, caught between the pain of leaving and the pain of staying, because leaving feels like betrayal and staying feels like slow death. And the Machiavellian insight here is brutal but freeing, that every system will extract from you what you allow. And love that requires self-destruction is not love, it is control. You survive things you still don't have words for, and surviving taught you skills that kept you alive. But now those same skills are suffocating you, because vigilance is not peace, compliance is not harmony, and silence is not safety. And the cost of maintaining the illusion is too high. You begin to sense a door opening, not an external door, but an internal one. A permission you never gave yourself before. The permission to define loyalty on your terms, to decide who gets access to you, to stop explaining your pain to people invested in misunderstanding it. And that permission feels dangerous, exhilarating, and terrifying, because it means stepping out of a story you were written into before you could consent. This is not about revenge. It's about reclamation, about taking back the authority over your own narrative, your own nervous system, your own future. And that reclamation begins with a quiet decision, one that doesn't announce itself, one that simply changes how you move. The hidden threat reveals itself here, not in them, but in you, because the greatest danger after family betrayal is not repeating the relationship. It's internalizing it, carrying the voice of your betrayers into every room, questioning your worth before anyone else can, doubting your instincts before you act, sabotaging your own momentum because success once came with punishment. This is how the past survives the present, not through memory, but through habit. And Machiavellian power begins when you identify the habits that no longer serve you and dismantle them deliberately, without apology, without explanation, because explanations are invitations for interference. You start to understand that distance is not cruelty, it's clarity, that boundaries are not punishments, they're filters, and that choosing yourself does not require their permission, even if your body reacts as if it does, because the body remembers what the mind has outgrown, and retraining it takes time. The fear they installed in you whispers that you'll be alone, that you'll regret this, that family is everything, and here is the forbidden counter-truth, that family is not defined by blood, but by behavior, by consistency, by respect, and that staying in a system that harms you does not make you loyal, it makes you available. This is where predator and prey switch places, because the moment you stop providing emotional labor, stop explaining yourself, stop reacting to provocations designed to pull you back into the role, the system destabilizes and they feel it, even if they can't name it, because your absence, emotional or physical, creates a vacuum, and vacuums expose dependence. They may escalate, accuse you of changing, of being cold, of forgetting where you came from, because systems in decline always blame the one who stops feeding them. And this is the final test, not of your love for them, but of your commitment to yourself. You don't need to convince anyone of your truth because truth does not require consensus. It requires alignment. And alignment begins when your actions match your awareness. When you stop seeking validation from people invested in your self-doubt. When you let their reactions belong to them. This is the deep conflict, the moment where you realize that healing is not about fixing the relationship. It's about fixing the relationship you have with your own perception, your own needs, your own boundaries. And that is a lonely road at first because it separates you from familiar chaos. But loneliness is not emptiness. It's space. And space is where power grows. You stand at the threshold now, not because everything is resolved, but because you can no longer unknow what you know, and the next steps will require restraint, discipline, and a willingness to be misunderstood. Because stepping out of a dysfunctional family system often looks like betrayal from the inside, even when it is survival. It's okay to feel this, the grief, the anger, the relief, the fear, because these emotions are signals that you're shedding a skin that kept you alive once, but now keeps you small. And the silence that follows is not abandonment. It's the quiet before you begin to hear your own voice clearly. The core revelation arrives not as a thunderclap, but as a settling, a deep exhale you didn't know you were holding. Because you finally understand that the pain was never proof of your weakness. It was evidence of prolonged exposure to a system that demanded your loyalty while quietly resenting your growth. And once you see that, something inside you stops begging to be understood and starts demanding to be respected, even if that respect comes only from yourself at first. You begin to reflect without romanticizing, without softening the edges, seeing clearly how often love was conditional, how approval was transactional, how warmth arrived only when you complied. And this reflection is not bitterness, it's audit, a calm inventory of emotional debts you've been paying for years without consent. And the moment you stop paying, the silence that follows feels terrifying and liberating all at once. This is where self-reflection becomes dangerous, because it asks you questions no one else dared to ask you. Questions like, why did you keep trying to earn what should have been given freely? Why did you tolerate disrespect dressed as familiarity? Why did you explain your pain to people who benefited from your confusion? And as these questions settle, you feel a strange mix of grief and relief. Grief for the years spent negotiating your worth. Relief that you can finally stop. You might notice yourself wanting to talk about this, to share it, to see if anyone else feels this way. And that impulse is not weakness. It's recognition. Because when you realize you weren't alone in this, when you sense that others are quietly carrying similar wounds, something shifts from isolation to connection. And that connection doesn't require permission from the people who hurt you. It's okay to feel this, the urge to name it, to acknowledge it, because acknowledgement is the first act of self-loyalty. And loyalty to yourself is the foundation of every other boundary you will ever set. And if this realization resonates, if it feels like someone finally put words to a weight you've been carrying, let yourself sit with that recognition. Let it deepen rather than rushing to resolve it. You're allowed to want more, not in a dramatic, explosive way, but in a quiet, uncompromising way, the kind of wanting that doesn't announce itself, that simply changes how you move, how you allocate energy, how you respond to guilt that no longer has authority over you. And this wanting is not rebellion, it's alignment. There's a subtle invitation here, not a demand, not a command, but an opening, to reflect on where you've been spending emotional currency without return, to notice patterns without judgment, to see yourself not as broken, but as someone who adapted brilliantly to a flawed environment and is now learning to adapt again on your terms. This is not the moment of action yet. It's the moment of truth, the moment where you stop negotiating reality, and that alone is a radical act. Small emotional moments begin to surface now, quiet memories that didn't seem important at the time, but suddenly carry weight. The look they gave you when you shared good news. The pause before congratulations that felt like a calculation. The way conversations subtly redirected away from your achievements. the jokes that landed like warnings, and you realize how often your body noticed before your mind allowed itself to know. You remember times you felt guilty for being happy, moments when success felt dangerous, like it might cost you belonging, and that fear wasn't imagined. It was learned, conditioned through repetition, through patterns that taught you celebration was acceptable only in moderation, only if it didn't disrupt the balance, only if it didn't threaten someone else's sense of importance. There are also moments of tenderness that complicate everything, memories of genuine care, real laughter, shared history, and this is where the pain sharpens, because it would be easier if they were purely cruel, but they weren't. They were inconsistent, and inconsistency is what binds people the longest, because it keeps hope alive, and hope without safety becomes a trap. You might feel anger rising now, not explosive, but steady, a low heat that scares you because you were taught anger was dangerous, that it would destroy relationships, that it made you ungrateful. But anger here is not destruction, it's boundary energy. It's the part of you that recognizes violation and wants to protect what matters. There may also be sadness, a deep, quiet mourning for the version of family you wanted but didn't have, and allowing yourself to feel that sadness without immediately forgiving, without rushing to make it noble, is an act of honesty, because premature forgiveness often serves the comfort of others, not your healing. In these micro moments, you start to practice something new, not reacting immediately, not explaining, not justifying, but observing your internal responses with curiosity, noticing how guilt arises automatically, how the urge to smooth things over appears before conflict even exists, and simply noticing begins to loosen the grip of those patterns. You survive things you still don't have words for, and survival taught you to prioritize peace over truth, but now you're learning that peace built on self-erasure is not peace. It's numbness, and numbness is not neutral. It quietly drains you of vitality, of direction, of joy. These small moments accumulate, not as evidence against them, but as data for you, information that helps you recalibrate your internal compass. And with each realization, the noise quiets just a little, making space for something unfamiliar, a sense of internal permission. You walk into a familiar room now, maybe a family gathering, maybe a conversation you've had 100 times before, but something is different, not outwardly, but internally, because you are watching yourself as much as you are watching them. Noticing how your shoulders tense, how your breathing shifts, how your mind prepares responses before words are spoken. You feel the old pull to perform, to be agreeable, to anticipate needs, but you also feel a pause, a fraction of a second where you choose not to rush, not to fill the silence, not to manage the atmosphere. And in that pause, there is power, not loud power, but grounded presence. You notice comments that once slipped past you now register clearly. The subtle comparisons, the dismissals masked as humor, the advice that feels more like correction, and instead of reacting, you let them pass. Not because you accept them, but because you no longer feel obligated to absorb them. You feel your feet on the ground, your breath steadying, your awareness expanding, and you realize that your power here is not confrontation, it's restraint, it's the ability to choose where your energy goes and where it doesn't, and that choice alone shifts the dynamic, even if no one names it. You might speak less, not out of fear, but out of selectivity, choosing words that are neutral, contained, not inviting debate, not offering explanations. And this feels strange at first, almost wrong, because you were taught to over-communicate to stay safe. But safety now comes from self-containment, not transparency. You feel moments of discomfort, theirs and yours, because systems react when roles change, but you also feel something else, a quiet steadiness, a sense that you are no longer auditioning for belonging. You are simply present, and presence without performance unsettles those who relied on your predictability. You notice how the room responds, subtle shifts, glances, pauses, and you understand that power dynamics are not changed by speeches. They are changed by behavior, by consistency, by what you no longer do, and as you hold this new posture, you feel the weight of years begin to lift. Not dramatically, but perceptibly. This is not about winning, it's about reclaiming, about inhabiting your body fully, about trusting your perception even when it contradicts the narrative you were given. And as you move through the interaction, you realize that the fear of losing them has been replaced by something else, a fear of losing yourself again. And that fear is protective. New questions emerge now, unresolved threads that linger intentionally because not everything needs immediate closure. Questions about what distance looks like for you, emotional or physical, about how much access feels safe, about what boundaries you can hold without explanation. And these questions are not demands. They are invitations to design your life with intention rather than reaction. You begin to see that clarity doesn't always bring comfort. Sometimes it brings loneliness, because stepping out of old patterns often means standing alone for a while. But loneliness here is not rejection, it's recalibration, a period where your nervous system learns a new baseline, one not defined by constant vigilance. You may wonder if they will ever understand, if they will change, if reconciliation is possible. And those questions remain open, not because they control your future, but because your future no longer depends on their answers. And that distinction is everything. Curiosity replaces urgency now. Curiosity about who you are without the weight of their expectations. Curiosity about relationships that don't require you to shrink. Curiosity about what becomes possible when your energy is no longer siphoned into maintaining illusions. And this curiosity is quiet, patient, and powerful. There are still risks ahead, moments where guilt will surge, where old habits will tempt you back, where silence will feel like punishment rather than peace. And these unresolved threads are not failures. They are part of the transition, reminders that growth is not linear, that power is practiced, not declared. You're not imagining this. The shift you feel is real, and it will continue to unfold in ways you can't fully predict yet, because unpredictability is the hallmark of transformation. And the system you came from may resist, may escalate, may attempt to pull you back into familiar roles. But you are no longer blind to the pattern. You stand at another threshold now, aware that the next phase will require discipline, patience, and a willingness to let others misunderstand you, because misunderstanding is often the price of self-respect. And that price, once terrifying, now feels negotiable. The story is not resolved here. It's deepening, moving towards something sharper, something quieter, something more dangerous in its calm. And the silence ahead is not empty. It's charged. Something breaks in the rhythm here, deliberately, because this part was never meant to feel smooth. It was meant to feel unsettling, like walking into a familiar house where the furniture has been moved just enough to make you doubt your memory. Because the deeper truth about family betrayal is not what they did, but what you now see that you cannot unsee. And once vision changes, comfort is never the same again. You begin to realize that the silence you once feared is no longer empty. It's observant, alert, watching patterns instead of reacting to them. And this new silence carries weight because it means you are no longer emotionally available on demand, no longer rushing to fix, to soothe, to explain. And that withdrawal is felt immediately by those who relied on your emotional presence to stabilize their own chaos. They sense it before they name it. A shift in energy, a resistance where compliance used to be, and this is where tension rises. Because systems don't collapse quietly. They test, they provoke, they look for the old reflexes, the guilt, the over-apology, the reassurance, and when those don't arrive, confusion sets in. You may notice attempts to pull you back in, sudden warmth, unexpected kindness, nostalgia weaponized as proof that things were never that bad, and this is where discernment becomes critical, because not every olive branch is peace. Some are hooks designed to reestablish access without addressing harm. Your body reacts first, a tightening, a hesitation, because part of you still wants to believe, still hopes for resolution without cost. But another part of you, quieter but steadier, recognizes the pattern, and instead of reacting, you pause, and that pause is everything, because it breaks the cycle. This rising suspense is not about confrontation, it's about containment, about holding your ground without theatrics, without explanations, without inviting debate. And that restraint feels unnatural at first because you were trained to equate love with availability. But now you're learning that love without boundaries is just exposure. The air feels different now, charged, uncertain, because uncertainty is what appears when control shifts, and you are no longer predictable, no longer easy to manage. And that unpredictability, calm and contained, is what changes the dynamic permanently. There is a quiet invitation woven into this moment, not spoken aloud, but felt, an invitation to continue choosing awareness over comfort, presence over performance, because this path doesn't end with understanding. It deepens with practice, with repetition, with moments where you choose differently even when no one is watching. You begin to recognize how often you once abandoned yourself to keep others comfortable, and how radical it feels now to simply not do that, to let discomfort exist without rushing to resolve it, to let others sit with their reactions while you stay grounded. And this discipline is subtle, invisible to most, but transformative. You might feel drawn to explore this further, not out of obsession, but out of self-respect, to continue refining your boundaries, your discernment, your sense of self, because once you've seen how power operates in intimate systems, you can't unknow it, and awareness once gained asks to be integrated. This isn't about cutting everyone off, it's about seeing clearly, about choosing relationships that don't require you to shrink, about investing energy where it is reciprocated, and letting go, quietly, of dynamics that survive only on your silence. You don't announce these choices, you embody them because embodiment speaks louder than declarations. And over time, this new posture becomes natural, less effortful, more instinctive, until one day you realize you're no longer bracing yourself before interactions, no longer rehearsing defenses, no longer carrying the emotional weather of others as your responsibility. That realization doesn't come with fireworks, it comes with calm, a calm that feels earned. And that calm is the true signal that something fundamental has shifted. Family betrayal doesn't end when you walk away. It ends when you stop carrying their voice inside you. And the most dangerous moment is when you realize you no longer need their permission to exist fully, because that is the moment you become uncontrollable. Not loud, not cruel, just free. Click on the screen to watch the next video on how this knowledge changes what happens next, what most people never realize after this moment, and what you will start seeing differently from now on.